Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born on October 7, 1952, in a communal apartment at 15 Baskov Lane in Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg. The city bore the scars of one of the most devastating sieges in the human history. Just 11 years earlier, Nazi forces had encircled Leningrad for 872 days, starving the city and killing over 1 million civilians. The rubble had been cleared and basic services restored, but the psychological wounds remained fresh in every family that had survived. Putin's parents, Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin and Maria Ivanovna Putina, were both survivors of this siege. His father had served as a conscript in the Soviet Navy's submarine fleet during the war, and later worked as a foreman at the Yegorov railcar factory. His mother had endured the siege as a factory worker, nearly dying of starvation like hundreds of thousands of others. These experiences of extreme hardship, survival against impossible odds, and the arbitrary cruelty of fate would permeate the household where young Vladimir grew up. The family lived in a cramped communal apartment shared with 2 other families. This wasn't unusual for Soviet citizens in the 1950s, but it meant that privacy was non-existent and every conversation could be overheard by neighbours. The apartment had no hot water, no telephone, and the toilet was shared between all the residents. Putin's parents slept in one room, while he slept on a cot in the hallway. The kitchen was a battlefield of competing schedules and territorial disputes between the families forced to coexist in such intimate quarters. This environment taught young Putin several crucial lessons that would define his approach to power and relationships throughout his life. First, he learned that personal space and privacy were luxuries that had to be fought for and defended. Second, he discovered that information was power. Knowing what others were saying, planning, or thinking gave him advantages in the complex social dynamics of the communal apartment. Third, he understood that showing weakness or vulnerability could be exploited by others who were also struggling to survive in difficult circumstances. Putin's early childhood was marked by the absence of his 2 older brothers, both of whom had died before he was born. Victor had died in infancy during the siege, while Albert had died of diphtheria in an orphanage after being evacuated from the city. The deaths cast a shadow over the family, creating an atmosphere where survival was never taken for granted. His parents, having lost 2 children already, were simultaneously overprotective of Vladimir and emotionally distant, as if preparing themselves for the possibility of losing him as well. The boy who would grow up to rule Russia was small for his age, thin and often sickly. His mother worried constantly about his health, a concern that wasn't unreasonable given the family's history and the harsh conditions of post-war Soviet life. Medical care was basic, nutrition was limited, and childhood diseases that are easily treatable today could be fatal. Putin learned early that physical strength and health couldn't be taken for granted, but also that mental toughness could compensate for physical limitations. School provided little respite from the harsh realities of his home life. Putin attended school number 193, a typical Soviet educational institution where discipline was strict, competition was fierce, and conformity was expected. He was an indifferent student at best, showing little interest in academic subjects and frequently getting into trouble with teachers. His grades were mediocre, and he seemed to lack the intellectual curiosity that might have marked him as a future leader. What Putin lacked in academic achievement, he made up for in street smarts and an almost thorough understanding of power dynamics. The communal courtyard behind his apartment building became his real classroom, where he learned lessons that no Soviet textbook could teach. This was where neighbourhood children gathered to play, fight, and establish the pecking orders that would determine who was respected and who was victimised. The courtyard was a microcosm of Soviet society, a place where resources were scarce, authority was often arbitrary, and survival depended on understanding unwritten rules and hidden hierarchies. Putin quickly learned that being small and weak made him a target, but also that intelligence, cunning, and the willingness to take risks could level the playing field. He developed a reputation for being fearless in fights, even when facing larger opponents, and for having an almost preternatural ability to sense weakness in others. One story that Putin himself has recounted from this period involves chasing a rat in the stairwell of his apartment building. When cornered, the rat turned and attacked him, forcing him to flee. This experience, he has said, taught him that even the smallest and seemingly weakest creatures would fight viciously when they had no other choice. It was a lesson he would apply throughout his life, understanding when to attack, when to retreat, and how to use the element of surprise against larger, more powerful opponents. The neighbourhood where Putin grew up was rough, even by Soviet standards. Leningrad in the 1950s and 1960s was a city still recovering from the war, where black market activities flourished in the shadows of official Soviet ideology. Criminal gangs operated with relative impunity, corruption was endemic at every level of society, and ordinary citizens learned to navigate complex networks of favors, bribes, and informal agreements just to secure basic necessities. Young Putin observed these dynamics with the keen eye of someone whose survival depended on understanding how power really worked, as opposed to how it was supposed to work according to official propaganda. He saw that the people who thrived weren't necessarily those who followed the rules, but those who understood which rules could be broken, when, and by whom. He learned that loyalty was valuable, but also conditional, that today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy, and that information about other people's weaknesses and secrets was a form of currency more reliable than rubles. His parents worked long hours at demanding jobs that paid little and offered no security. His father's position at the railway factory was considered relatively good for a working-class man, but it still meant 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions for wages that barely covered the family's basic needs. His mother cleaned offices and apartment buildings, work that was physically exhausting and socially invisible but necessary for the family's survival. These circumstances meant that Putin spent much of his childhood unsupervised, free to roam the streets and learn the harsh lessons of urban survival. He became part of a loose network of neighborhood children who looked out for each other while also competing for limited resources and social status. This experience taught him the importance of building alliances while maintaining the ability to act independently when necessary. The absence of reliable adult supervision also meant that Putin had to develop his own moral compass, often in situations where the official Soviet values taught in school conflicted with the practical realities of daily life. He learned that survival sometimes required lying, stealing, or fighting, even though these activities were officially condemned. More importantly, he learned that the key to avoiding consequences wasn't necessarily avoiding bad behavior, but rather avoiding getting caught, or ensuring that the people who caught you had reasons to look the other way. Putin's introduction to organized sports came through boxing and later sambo, a Soviet martial art that combined elements of judo and wrestling. Sports provided him with a structured outlet for his aggressive tendencies and a way to build the physical strength he lacked naturally. But more than that, martial arts taught him discipline, strategy, and the importance of understanding an opponent's weaknesses before engaging in combat. His coaches in these sports became some of the most important adult influences in his life, providing the mentorship and guidance that was largely absent from his home environment. They taught him that success wasn't just about individual skill, but about preparation, patience, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. These lessons would prove invaluable throughout his later career, whether he was navigating the bureaucratic infighting of the Soviet system or the geopolitical chess games of international relations. The practice of martial arts also introduced Putin to a philosophy that would shape his worldview, the idea that conflict was natural and inevitable, but that victory belonged to those who were better prepared, more disciplined, and more willing to do whatever was necessary to win. This wasn't the gentlemanly competition celebrated in Western sports, but a more primal understanding of combat as a test of will, intelligence, and commitment. As Putin entered his teenage years, the Soviet Union was beginning to show signs of the stagnation that would eventually lead to its collapse. The economy was struggling, consumer goods were increasingly scarce, and the gap between official propaganda and daily reality was becoming impossible to ignore. For young people coming of age in this environment, cynicism was almost inevitable. They were told they lived in the greatest society ever created while standing in lines for basic necessities and watching their parents struggle to make ends meet. Putin's response to this cognitive dissonance was different from many of his peers. Rather than becoming disillusioned with the Soviet system, he became fascinated by the mechanics of power itself. He wanted to understand how the system really worked, who made the decisions that affected ordinary people's lives, and how someone like him might gain access to that inner circle of influence and control. This interest led him to pay close attention to the adults in his neighborhood, who seemed to have found ways to thrive despite the official limitations of Soviet society. These included low-level Communist Party officials, black market entrepreneurs, and individuals with connections to the security services. What they had in common wasn't adherence to ideology, but rather an understanding of how to navigate informal networks, how to accumulate and use information, and how to build relationships based on mutual benefit rather than sentiment. The television programs and films that Putin watched during his childhood reinforced these lessons about the importance of intelligence, cunning and loyalty to the state. Soviet popular culture of the 1960s was filled with stories about heroic intelligence officers who sacrificed everything for their country, using their wits and courage to outmaneuver enemies who threatened the motherland. These weren't just entertainment, they were recruitment tools designed to inspire young people to consider careers in the security services. Putin was particularly drawn to stories about the Great Patriotic War, as World War II was known in the Soviet Union. These narratives emphasized the importance of vigilance against external enemies, the necessity of strong leadership during times of crisis, and the idea that individual sacrifice for the greater good was the highest form of patriotism. They also suggested that the Soviet Union was surrounded by hostile forces that required constant monitoring and occasional preemptive action to neutralize. His fascination with these themes led Putin to begin thinking seriously about a career in the KGB, the Soviet Union's premier intelligence and security agency. This wasn't an unusual aspiration for ambitious young men of his generation, but it was one that required careful preparation and absolute discretion. The KGB recruited only the most reliable and capable individuals, and the selection process was designed to weed out anyone with questionable loyalty or insufficient intellectual ability. The decision to pursue a career in intelligence wasn't just about personal ambition, it was also a practical response to the limited opportunities available to someone from a Putin's background. Higher education was theoretically available to all Soviet citizens, but in practice, admission to the best universities and most prestigious career paths was largely determined by family connections, political reliability, and social class. Putin's family had none of the advantages that might have opened doors to conventional success. What they did have was a deep understanding of how to survive and thrive in difficult circumstances, a network of relationships built through shared hardship, and a young man who had learned to observe, adapt, and seize opportunities when they presented themselves. These skills, developed during his harsh childhood in post-war Leningrad, would prove more valuable than any formal education in preparing him for the challenges that lay ahead. The neighborhood that shaped Putin's early years was also a training ground in the kind of zero-sum thinking that would characterize his approach to leadership. Resources were limited, competition was intense, and showing mercy to opponents was often seen as weakness that could be exploited. Success meant not just achieving your own goals, but preventing others from achieving theirs. Cooperation was possible, but only when it served mutual interest, and alliances were always temporary. These early experiences created a worldview in which conflict was normal, trust was dangerous, and power was the only reliable source of security. Putin learned to see life as a series of contests, where the stakes were often survival itself, and where the difference between victory and defeat could determine not just personal success, but whether you and your family would have enough to eat, a safe place to sleep, and protection from those who might wish you harm. By the time Putin graduated from secondary school in 1970, he had developed the core characteristics that would define his adult personality and leadership style. He was disciplined but flexible, loyal but calculating, and capable of both patience and sudden decisive action. He understood that information was power, that relationships were transactional, and that the ability to inspire both fear and loyalty was essential for anyone who wanted to control their own destiny. Most importantly, he had learned that the official version of events was often different from the reality, that the people who succeeded were those who understood these differences, and that true power lay not in following rules but in making them. These lessons, learned in the communal apartments and courtyard battles of post-war Leningrad, would guide him through law school, KGB training, and eventually to the highest levels of power in Russia. The poverty and hardship of Putin's childhood weren't obstacles to overcome. They were formative experiences that shaped his understanding of human nature, political power, and what it meant to survive and succeed in a world where weakness was dangerous and strength was the only currency that mattered. The small boy who chased rats in Leningrad stairwells had learned lessons that would serve him well in the far more dangerous corridors of power that awaited him. Putin's path to the KGB began with a decision that would have seemed impossible to most young men from his background. In 1970, at age 18, he walked into the Leningrad office of the Committee for State Security and announced his intention to become a spy. The receptionist looked at this thin, unremarkable teenager and probably assumed he was either joking or delusional. The KGB didn't recruit walk-ins from communal apartments. They selected their officers through careful vetting processes that typically began in the elite universities and Communist Youth League organizations. But Putin had done his research. He'd learned that while the KGB preferred to recruit from prestigious institutions like Moscow State University, they also needed officers who understood how ordinary Soviet citizens lived and thought. His working-class background, combined with his demonstrated toughness and street smarts, might actually be advantages rather than obstacles. The key was getting their attention and proving that his unconventional background had given him skills they could use. The official who eventually interviewed Putin was intrigued enough by his boldness to give him serious consideration. It was a young man who had clearly thought carefully about what he wanted and wasn't deterred by the obvious obstacles. That kind of determination and self-confidence suggested the psychological resilience that intelligence work demanded. More importantly, his background meant he could blend into environments where officers from privileged families would stand out immediately. However, the KGB had requirements that couldn't be waived regardless of Putin's potential. He needed a university education, preferably in law, which would provide both intellectual training and useful skills for intelligence work. Legal training taught students to analyze complex situations, understand bureaucratic processes, and think systematically about evidence and proof. These were exactly the capabilities the KGB needed in its officers. Putin enrolled in the law faculty at Leningrad State University in 1970, but his real education was already beginning. The KGB had made it clear that his eventual recruitment depended not just on academic performance, but on demonstrating the qualities they valued most: loyalty, discretion, analytical ability, and the capacity to maintain cover identities under pressure. University became a testing ground where every friendship, every political discussion, and every personal choice was potentially being evaluated by unseen observers. Leningrad State University in the early 1970s was a hotbed of intellectual ferment, despite the official atmosphere of ideological conformity. Students debated philosophy, literature, and politics with a sophistication that would have surprised Western observers who viewed Soviet education as mere indoctrination. But these discussions took place in a context where certain topics were forbidden, where expressing the wrong opinion could end a promising career before it began, and where everyone understood that some classmates might be reporting conversations to authorities. Putin navigated this environment with the skills he'd learned in the communal apartments and neighborhood streets of his childhood. He participated in discussions without revealing his true thoughts, formed friendships without complete trust, and observed everything while appearing to be just another unremarkable law student. His professors would later remember him as competent but not brilliant, engaged but not passionate, someone who completed assignments adequately without drawing attention to himself. This ability to be simultaneously present and invisible was exactly what the KGB was looking for in its future officers. Intelligence work required people who could blend into any environment, gather information without arousing suspicion, and maintain psychological distance even from those they appeared to befriend. Putin's natural reserve and analytical temperament made him ideal for this kind of work. During his university years, Putin also began the physical and psychological conditioning that would prepare him for operational assignments. The KGB's training programs were designed to test not just intellectual capacity, but mental toughness, emotional stability, and the ability to function under extreme stress. Candidates learned to compartmentalize their emotions, maintain multiple identities, and make rapid decisions in ambiguous situations where the wrong choice could be fatal. The training included extensive study of foreign languages, cultures, and political systems. Putin focused particularly on German, partly because of his fascination with the country that had nearly destroyed his hometown, and partly because East Germany was a crucial arena for Cold War intelligence operations. Understanding German culture, politics, and society would be essential for any officer assigned to operate in the heart of divided Europe. But language training was just the beginning. Putin also studied psychology, learning to read people's motivations, fears and weaknesses. He learned how to build rapport with potential sources, how to apply pressure without triggering defensive reactions, and how to exploit personal vulnerabilities for professional purposes. These skills required a particular kind of emotional detachment, the ability to appear sympathetic and trustworthy while calculating how to use another person's confidences against them. The philosophical framework underlying KGB training was fundamentally different from Western intelligence services. While agencies like the CIA and MI6 operated within democratic systems that placed some constraints on their activities, the KGB served a totalitarian state that recognized no meaningful distinction between domestic and foreign enemies. Soviet intelligence officers were taught that they were soldiers in an ongoing war for the survival of their ideology and way of life. This worldview shaped every aspect of their training and operations. Lying, manipulation, blackmail, and violence weren't unforeseen unfortunate necessities. They were legitimate tools in a struggle where the stakes were nothing less than the future of human civilization. Officers were encouraged to think of themselves as elite warriors, defending socialism against capitalist enemies who would show no mercy if the positions were reversed. Putin absorbed these lessons completely, but he also brought his own interpretation to them based on his childhood experiences. Where other officers might see ideological struggle, he saw practical competition for power and resources. Where they might focus on defending communist principles, he concentrated on advancing Soviet interests and his own position within the system. His loyalty was less to abstract ideas than to concrete institutions and personal relationships. After graduating from law school in 1975, Putin was formally recruited by the KGB and began intensive training at the organization's facilities outside Leningrad. The curriculum covered everything from advanced surveillance techniques to methods of covert communication, from hand-to-hand combat to the finer points of diplomatic protocol. But the most important lessons concerned the psychology of intelligence work, how to maintain operational security, how to assess and recruit human sources, and how to operate effectively in hostile environments. The training was deliberately designed to be psychologically stressful. Candidates were subjected to sleep deprivation, impossible deadlines, and scenarios where they had to choose between competing loyalties. The instructors wanted to identify potential weaknesses before officers were deployed in real operations where such vulnerabilities could prove fatal. They also wanted to ensure that graduates understood the absolute importance of following orders and maintaining secrecy, regardless of personal cost. Putin excelled in this environment, demonstrating the emotional control and analytical thinking that his instructors valued. He showed particular aptitude for the kind of long-term strategic thinking that intelligence work required, the ability to pursue objectives patiently over months or years, adapting tactics as circumstances changed while never losing sight of the ultimate goal. His first assignment was to the Leningrad office of the KGB, where he worked in counterintelligence operations focused on foreign visitors and suspected dissidents. This was routine work that involved surveillance, background investigations, and the cultivation of informants within various social and professional groups. It wasn't glamorous, but it provided essential experience in the practical application of intelligence tradecraft. The work required Putin to develop detailed knowledge of Leningrad's foreign community, including diplomats, journalists, businessmen, and academics who might be intelligence officers operating under official cover. He learned to identify patterns of behavior that might indicate espionage activities, to spot surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques, and to build networks of sources who could provide information about suspicious activities. This assignment also gave Putin his first real experience with the moral ambiguities of intelligence work. He was required to cultivate relationships with people who trusted him, only to betray that trust when operational requirements demanded it. He had to make decisions about which dissidents posed genuine threats to state security, and which were simply expressing frustration with daily life in the Soviet Union. He learned to compartmentalize his personal feelings and focus on institutional objectives. The psychological toll of this work was considerable, even for someone as emotionally controlled as Putin. Intelligence officers often struggled with depression, alcoholism, and relationship problems as a result of the constant deception and moral compromise their jobs required. The KGB provided some support for these issues, but the organization's culture emphasized toughness and self-reliance over psychological counseling. Putin's response was to double down on the analytical and strategic aspects of intelligence work while maintaining emotional distance from its human costs. He became known among his colleagues as someone who could be relied upon to complete difficult assignments without allowing personal feelings to interfere with operational effectiveness. This reputation would serve him well as he advanced through the organization's hierarchy. His superiors were impressed not just by his competence, but by his ambition and his willingness to take on challenging assignments that other officers might avoid. When the opportunity arose for foreign posting, Putin volunteered immediately, even though such assignments typically involved years of separation from family and friends and carried significant personal risks. The selection process for foreign assignments was even more rigorous than initial recruitment. Candidates underwent extensive psychological evaluation, additional training in specialized skills, and careful vetting of their personal relationships and financial situation. The KGB couldn't afford to have officers defect or be compromised while operating abroad, so only the most reliable and capable individuals were chosen for such positions. Putin's childhood experiences of hardship and survival served him well during this evaluation process. He had already demonstrated his ability to function effectively under stress, to maintain secrets under pressure, and to adapt to changing circumstances without losing focus on his objectives. His lack of strong personal attachments or ideological commitments was actually an advantage, since it reduced the likelihood that he might be swayed by emotional appeals or conflicting loyalties. The training for foreign operations was intensive and specialized. Putin learned advanced surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques, methods of covert communication, and procedures for handling classified material in hostile environments. He studied the political systems, social structures, and cultural norms of potential assignment locations, paying particular attention to how these factors might affect intelligence operations. But the most important aspect of his preparation was psychological. Operating abroad meant living under constant stress, maintaining false identities for extended periods, and making split-second decisions that could determine the success or failure of important operations. Officers needed not just technical skills, but the mental discipline to function effectively while isolated from their normal support system. Putin's assignment to Dresden in East Germany in 1985 represented both the culmination of his training and the beginning of his real education in international affairs. Dresden was a strategic location for Soviet intelligence operations, close enough to West Germany to facilitate espionage activities, but secure enough to serve as a base for long-term operations. The city was also politically significant as a symbol of Soviet influence in the heart of Europe. His cover position was as a translator and liaison officer, work that gave him legitimate reasons to interact with a wide range of East German officials, visiting Soviet personnel, and occasionally Western visitors. This position also provided access to classified information about East German government activities and Soviet policy decisions that affected the entire Warsaw Pact region. The Dresden assignment exposed Putin to a broader world than he had known in Leningrad. He observed firsthand how the Soviet system functioned in an allied country, how local populations responded to communist rule, and how Western intelligence services operated in contested territory. These experiences broadened his understanding of international relations and gave him insights into the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet system. More importantly, the assignment taught Putin about the practical limitations of ideological power. East Germany was supposedly a model socialist state, but Putin could see that its stability depended on Soviet military presence and economic support rather than popular enthusiasm for communist principles. This understanding would prove crucial in shaping his later approach to governance, which emphasized practical results over ideological purity. The work in Dresden also required Putin to develop skills in managing complex relationships with multiple parties who had different interests and objectives. He had to coordinate with Soviet intelligence headquarters, maintain productive relationships with East German security services, and occasionally interact with their Western counterparts in situations that required diplomatic finesse rather than confrontation. These experiences taught him that successful intelligence work required not just technical competence, but political sophistication and cultural sensitivity. Officers who understood how to work within existing power structures, who could identify and exploit the interests and weaknesses of various players, were far more effective than those who relied solely on covert methods or ideological appeals. Putin's time in Dresden coincided with the beginning of the end of the Cold War, though this wasn't apparent at the time. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms were creating new uncertainties within the Soviet system, while popular unrest in Eastern Europe was challenging the foundations of communist rule. Intelligence officers found themselves trying to assess rapidly changing situations with incomplete information and conflicting guidance from headquarters. The experience of watching the Berlin Wall fall in 1989 and seeing the collapse of East German communism was profoundly formative for Putin. He witnessed firsthand how quickly apparently stable political systems could disintegrate when they lost popular support and external backing. He also saw how individual decisions by key leaders could accelerate or slow such processes, and how intelligence services could find themselves powerless to prevent fundamental political changes. These observations reinforced Putin's belief in the importance of strong centralized authority and his skepticism about democratic processes that might lead to political instability. The chaos that followed German reunification, with its economic disruption and social upheaval, seemed to confirm his view that rapid political change was inherently dangerous, and that stability should be valued over ideological purity or popular participation. When Putin returned to Leningrad in 1990, he brought with him not just professional experience, but a sophisticated understanding of how political power actually functioned in the modern world. His KGB training had taught him to analyze complex situations, to identify and exploit weaknesses in opponents, and to maintain operational security under pressure. His foreign assignment had shown him how these skills could be applied in the real world of international politics and domestic governance. The combination of his harsh childhood, professional intelligence training, and international experience had created someone uniquely prepared for the political opportunities that would soon emerge in post-Soviet Russia. Putin understood both the streets and the corridors of power, both the psychology of survival and the mechanics of institutional control. Most importantly, he had learned that in a world of competing interests and limited resources, victory belonged to those who were best prepared, most disciplined, and most willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve their objectives. The KGB years had transformed the small boy from the Leningrad communal apartments into a professional intelligence officer with sophisticated understanding of power, information, and control. These skills would serve him well in the chaotic 1990s that lay ahead, when the collapse of the Soviet Union would create opportunities for those bold and capable enough to seize them. Putin's return to Leningrad in 1990 was jarring in ways he hadn't anticipated. The city he'd known as a child and young man was disappearing before his eyes, transformed by political upheaval and economic chaos that made his familiar streets feel foreign. The Soviet Union was collapsing in the slow motion, taking with it not just a political system, but an entire way of life that had defined 3 generations of Russians. The KGB itself was under attack from reformers who saw the intelligence services as symbols of everything wrong with the old system. Officers were being dismissed, budgets were being slashed, and the organization's prestige was evaporating as quickly as the ideology it had served. For someone like Putin, whose entire adult identity had been built around his role as a Soviet intelligence officer, this dissolution represented both personal crisis and unexpected opportunity. His first challenge was simply figuring out how to make a living in a country where his primary skills, surveillance, intelligence analysis, and covert operations, had limited application in the legitimate economy. The chaos of the transition period meant that many former security officers were turning to private security work, organized crime, or immigration. Putin chose a different path, one that would keep him close to power while allowing him to learn how the new Russia was taking shape. Through contacts he'd made during his KGB service, Putin secured a position at Leningrad State University as an assistant to the rector for international affairs. This wasn't a prestigious appointment, but it served several important purposes. It gave him legitimate employment during a period when many former intelligence officers were struggling financially. More importantly, it provided a platform for observing and understanding the political transformation that was reshaping Russian society. The university position also allowed Putin to maintain relationships with former colleagues while building new networks among the academics, foreign visitors, and business leaders who were becoming increasingly important in the new economic order. He used his language skills and international experience to facilitate partnerships between the university and Western institutions, work that brought him into contact with people who would prove valuable allies in his later political career. But Putin's real education during this period came from his observation of how power was being redistributed in post-Soviet Russia. The old Communist Party apparatus was losing authority, but new centers of influence were emerging among regional leaders, business entrepreneurs, and organized crime groups. Understanding these shifting dynamics required the same analytical skills he'd developed as an intelligence officer, but applied to a domestic political environment rather than foreign espionage. His opportunity to move closer to real political power came through his relationship with Anatoly Sobchak, a law professor who had become one of Leningrad's most prominent reform politicians. Sobchak had known Putin slightly during his university years and remembered him as a competent, reliable student. When Sobchak was elected mayor of the newly renamed St. Petersburg in 1991, he needed staff members who could handle complex administrative tasks while maintaining absolute loyalty. Putin's combination of legal training, international experience, and proven discretion made him an ideal candidate for Sobchak's inner circle. His appointment as deputy mayor for external relations wasn't based on democratic qualifications or popular appeal, but on the mayor's assessment that Putin could be trusted with sensitive responsibilities and wouldn't use his position to pursue personal political ambitions. This assessment proved accurate, but for reasons Sobchak probably didn't fully understand. Putin wasn't interested in competing with his patron for public attention or electoral support. His goals were more strategic: to learn how the new political system functioned, to build relationships with key players, and to position himself for opportunities that might emerge as Russia continued its transformation. The deputy mayor position gave Putin his first real experience with the practical challenges of governance in a democratic system. St. Petersburg was struggling with massive economic problems, deteriorating infrastructure, and social tensions that threatened to explode into violence. The city government had limited resources and even less experience with the kind of public administration that Western democracies took for granted. Putin's responsibilities included managing the city's international relationships, overseeing foreign investment projects, and coordinating with federal agencies on issues that affected St. Petersburg's development. This work required him to master skills that weren't taught in KGB training: public speaking, media relations, bureaucratic negotiation, and the delicate art of balancing competing interests among various stakeholders. One of his most important assignments involved managing the city's relationship with foreign investors who were eager to take advantage of Russia's economic liberalization. This work brought Putin into contact with Western businessmen, diplomats, and government officials who were trying to understand the opportunities and risks of operating in post-Soviet Russia. These interactions taught him valuable lessons about international business practices and global economic trends. But Putin's most significant learning experience during this period involved his observation of how corruption functioned in the new Russia. The collapse of central planning had created enormous opportunities for personal enrichment among those with access to state resources or regulatory authority. Many officials were taking advantage of these opportunities with little regard for legal or ethical constraints. Putin approached this environment with characteristic calculation. He understood that corruption was endemic and that trying to remain completely clean would limit his effectiveness and career prospects. But he also recognized that uncontrolled corruption could destabilize the entire system and create vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. His response was to engage in corrupt practices selectively and strategically, always maintaining plausible deniability while building networks of mutual obligation with other officials. This approach reflected the intelligence officer's mentality that Putin had developed during his KGB years. Corruption wasn't a moral failing to be condemned, but a tool to be used judiciously in pursuit of larger objectives. The key was understanding which rules could be broken, when, and by whom, while maintaining enough legitimacy to function effectively within official structures. His work in St. Petersburg also gave Putin his first exposure to the oligarchs, who were emerging as major players in Russian politics and economics. These were typically young, ambitious entrepreneurs who had used their connections, intelligence, and willingness to take risks to accumulate enormous wealth during the privatization of state assets. Their influence was growing rapidly, and they were beginning to shape national policy through their relationships with politicians and their control of major media outlets. Putin studied these figures carefully, learning how they had built their empires and how they maintained their influence. He was particularly interested in their relationship with government officials, how they used financial resources to buy political protection, how they leveraged their economic power to influence policy decisions, and how they managed the inherent tensions between their business interests and their political activities. This analysis led Putin to several important conclusions that would shape his later approach to governing. First, he recognized that economic power and political power were increasingly intertwined in post-Soviet Russia, making it essential for any serious politician to understand business and finance. Second, he saw that the oligarchs' influence derived partly from the weakness of government institutions, suggesting that strengthening state capacity could alter the balance of power. Third, he understood that controlling key sectors of the economy, particularly energy and media, could provide enormous political leverage. Putin's relationship with Sobchak provided him with a front-row seat for observing both the possibilities and limitations of democratic politics in Russia. Sobchak was genuinely committed to reform and had significant popular support, but he struggled to translate electoral success into effective governance. The mayor's administration was hampered by inexperience, limited resources, and constant conflict with other levels of government. More troubling from Putin's perspective was Sobchak's vulnerability to political attack from opponents who weren't constrained by democratic norms. The mayor faced constant accusations of corruption, efforts to undermine his authority through bureaucratic sabotage, and personal attacks that went far beyond legitimate political criticism. Putin observed that democratic politicians who played by the rules were often disadvantaged against opponents who were willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goal. These experiences reinforced Putin's skeptical view of democratic processes and his belief that strong centralized authority was necessary for effective governance. Democracy might be useful for legitimizing political decisions and maintaining social stability, but it couldn't be allowed to interfere with the practical requirements of governing a complex society facing serious challenges. Putin's administrative work also brought him into contact with organized crime groups that had significant influence in St. Petersburg's economy. The collapse of central authority had created opportunities for criminal organizations to expand their activities beyond traditional areas like drugs and prostitution into legitimate businesses, construction contracts, and financial services. Many city officials found it necessary to cooperate with these groups in order to accomplish basic governmental functions. Managing these relationships required skills that weren't taught in any university or training program. Putin had to understand the internal dynamics of criminal organizations, assess their capabilities and limitations, and find ways to use their resources while avoiding complete dependence on their cooperation. This experience taught him valuable lessons about power dynamics in situations where formal legal structures were weak or non-existent. The criminal environment also reinforced lessons Putin had learned during his childhood about the importance of reputation, the value of unpredictability, and the necessity of being willing to use violence when other methods failed. Organized crime groups respected strength and despised weakness, making it essential for government officials to project confidence and capability, even in situations where their actual power was limited. Throughout his years working for Sobchak, Putin maintained his characteristic low profile while carefully observing everything happening around him. He avoided taking public positions on controversial issues, built relationships across factional lines, and focused on administrative competence rather than political innovation. This approach protected him from the factional conflicts that destroyed many other officials, while allowing him to accumulate knowledge and contacts that would prove valuable later. His loyalty to Sobchak was genuine, but not sentimental. Putin understood that his patron's political career was likely to be limited by the chaos of the transition period and the mayor's own idealistic approach to politics. When Sobchak lost his re-election bid in 1996, Putin faced a choice that would determine the trajectory of his future career. The safe option would have been to seek another administrative position in St. Petersburg's government, or perhaps in the private sector. Putin's experience and connections would have guaranteed him comfortable employment with minimal risk, but he had learned enough about the new Russia to understand that real opportunities lay at the federal level, where the most important decisions were being made and the largest rewards were available for those bold enough to seize them. His decision to move to Moscow represented both ambition and calculation. Putin recognized that his provincial experience, while valuable, was insufficient preparation for operating at the highest levels of Russian politics. He needed to understand how federal institutions functioned, how national policy was made, and how international relationships affected domestic politics. Most importantly, he needed to build relationships with the people who controlled access to real power. The contacts he'd made during his St. Petersburg years proved crucial in facilitating this transition. Former colleagues who had moved to Moscow, business leaders with federal connections, and academic contacts with policy influence all played roles in introducing Putin to the networks that dominated Russian politics. His reputation for competence, loyalty, and discretion preceded him and opened doors that might have remained closed to someone with different credentials. Putin's move to Moscow in 1996 marked the end of his apprenticeship in post-Soviet politics and the beginning of his serious pursuit of national power. His years in St. Petersburg had taught him how the new Russia actually functioned, as opposed to how it was supposed to work according to democratic theory. He understood the role of corruption, organized crime, and oligarchic influence in the political system. He had learned to navigate competing factions while maintaining his own independence and building his own power base. Most importantly, Putin had developed a clear vision of what kind of leader Russia needed during its transition period. The country required someone who understood both traditional Russian political culture and modern international realities, someone who could work within democratic institutions while recognizing their limitations, and someone who could project strength and competence while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. The experience in St. Petersburg had shown Putin that democratic politics alone were insufficient for governing a society undergoing fundamental transformation. Effective leadership required understanding informal power structures, building coalitions among diverse and often conflicting interests, and maintaining control over key institutions, while allowing enough flexibility to respond to unexpected challenges. These lessons would prove invaluable as Putin prepared for the next phase of his career. His intelligence background had taught him to analyze complex situations and develop strategic responses. His St. Petersburg experience had shown him how political power actually functioned in post-Soviet Russia. Now he was ready to apply these skills at the national level. Where the stakes were higher, but the potential rewards were correspondingly greater. The young man who returned from Dresden as the Soviet Union collapsed had been transformed during his years in St. Petersburg into a sophisticated political operator with deep understanding of both Russian political culture and international realities. Putin was no longer simply a former intelligence officer looking for employment. He had become someone capable of competing effectively in the highest levels of Russian politics, with the skills, knowledge and ambition necessary to pursue ultimate power. Putin's arrival in Moscow in 1996 thrust him into the eye of a political and economic hurricane that was reshaping Russia in ways that few observers fully understood. The capital was a city of stark contrasts, where newly minted billionaires built palatial mansions, while pensioners sold personal belongings on street corners to buy bread. The Soviet-planned economy had been replaced by a form of capitalism so chaotic and predatory that it resembled economic warfare more than legitimate business. At the centre of this transformation were the oligarchs, a small group of businessmen who had accumulated enormous wealth by acquiring state assets during the privatization process. These weren't traditional capitalists who had built businesses through innovation or market competition. They were opportunists who had used political connections, financial manipulation and sometimes violence to gain control of entire industries that had previously belonged to the Soviet state. The oligarchs' influence extended far beyond their business empires. They owned major television networks, newspapers and radio stations that shaped public opinion. They funded political campaigns, lobbied government officials, and used their resources to influence policy decisions at the highest levels. Some had become so powerful that they effectively controlled entire regions of the country, ruling like feudal lords with their own security forces and political machines. Putin's first position in Moscow was in the presidential administration's main control directorate, an obscure department responsible for monitoring the implementation of presidential decrees. This wasn't a high-profile appointment, but it served Putin's purposes perfectly. The position gave him access to classified information about government operations, while allowing him to observe power dynamics without becoming a target of factional conflicts. The main control directorate was essentially an internal intelligence service within the federal government, tasked with ensuring that presidential orders were actually carried out by various ministries and agencies. This work required skills that Putin had developed during his KGB years: the ability to analyze complex bureaucratic systems, identify points of resistance or corruption, and develop strategies for overcoming obstacles to policy implementation. More importantly, the position allowed Putin to study the oligarchs and their relationships with government officials at close range. He observed how they used their wealth to purchase political influence, how they competed with each other for access to new privatization opportunities, and how they managed their relationships with international partners who provided financing and technical expertise for their business operations. Putin's analysis of the oligarch system revealed both its strengths and vulnerabilities. The oligarchs were individually powerful, but they were also rivals who competed fiercely with each other for market share and political influence. Their wealth made them influential, but it also made them dependent on maintaining positive relationships with government officials who could change regulations, investigate their business practices, or alter tax policies in ways that could destroy their empires overnight. Most importantly, Putin recognized that the oligarchs' power was based on the weakness of government institutions rather than their own inherent strength. They thrived in an environment where the rule of law was weak, regulatory enforcement was inconsistent, and political leaders lacked the resources or will to challenge their influence. Strengthening state capacity could fundamentally alter this balance of power. His work in the main control directorate brought Putin to the attention of Pavel Borodin, who managed the presidential administration's property and finances. Borodin was impressed by Putin's analytical skills, his attention to detail, and his ability to handle sensitive assignments without attracting unwanted attention. When Borodin needed someone to oversee the administration's foreign property portfolio, Putin was his natural choice. This new assignment involved managing Russian government properties abroad, including diplomatic facilities, trade missions, and various assets that had been acquired during the Soviet period. The work required extensive travel, complex negotiations with foreign governments, and careful coordination with multiple Russian agencies that had overlapping jurisdictions. It also involved significant financial transactions that needed to be handled with absolute discretion. The foreign property assignment gave Putin valuable experience in international finance and diplomacy, while expanding his network of contacts within the government bureaucracy. He demonstrated the same competence and reliability that had characterized his earlier work, but he also began to show more initiative and strategic thinking. His superiors noticed that Putin didn't just complete assigned tasks, he anticipated problems, developed innovative solutions, and took responsibility for results. This evolution reflected Putin's growing confidence in his understanding of how the Russian political system functioned. His years observing the chaos of the 1990s had taught him that success required more than technical competence or bureaucratic skill. Effective leadership demanded the ability to navigate competing interests, build coalitions among diverse stakeholders, and project strength and confidence even in uncertain situations. Putin's reputation for competence and discretion eventually brought him to the attention of the oligarchs themselves. Some began reaching out through intermediaries to explore whether he might be useful as a contact within the government bureaucracy. These approaches were carefully calibrated, not direct corruption attempts, but subtle efforts to establish relationships that might prove mutually beneficial. Putin's response to these overtures revealed the sophisticated political instincts he had developed. He maintained cordial relationships with oligarch representatives without making specific commitments or accepting obligations that might compromise his independence. He understood that completely refusing contact would limit his effectiveness and career prospects, but he also recognized that becoming too closely associated with any particular oligarch could be dangerous if political wind shifted. This balancing act required constant calculation and careful management of multiple relationships. Putin had to understand each oligarch's interests, capabilities, and vulnerabilities, while presenting himself as potentially useful without appearing eager or desperate. He needed to demonstrate value to these powerful figures while maintaining enough distance to preserve his options and avoid becoming dependent on their continued support. The oligarchs' interest in Putin reflected their recognition that traditional methods of influencing government policy were becoming less reliable. President Boris Yeltsin's health was declining, making it unclear who would make important decisions or how long current policies would remain in effect. The oligarchs needed contacts within the government bureaucracy who could provide information about policy changes and help them navigate an increasingly unpredictable political environment. Putin's position in the presidential administration made him particularly valuable because he had access to information about government operations while maintaining a relatively low profile that wouldn't attract unwanted attention from rival factions. His intelligence background suggested that he understood the importance of operational security and could be trusted with sensitive information. His lack of obvious political ambitions made him seem like a safe contact who wouldn't use his relationships with oligarchs to advance his own agenda at their expense. But Putin was using these relationships for exactly that purpose, though in ways that the oligarchs didn't fully appreciate. Every interaction taught him more about how they operated, what they feared, and where their vulnerabilities lay. He was building a comprehensive understanding of the oligarch system that would prove invaluable when he gained the power to challenge it directly. His careful cultivation of these relationships also demonstrated Putin's long-term strategic thinking. He wasn't interested in immediate financial benefits or short-term political advantages. Instead, he was positioning himself for opportunities that might emerge as Russia's political system continued to evolve. The oligarchs represented one power center that any serious politician would need to understand and potentially confront, so building relationships with them was an essential investment in his future prospects. Putin's work during this period also brought him into contact with international business leaders and government officials who were trying to understand Russia's transformation and identify opportunities for their own countries and companies. These interactions gave him insights into how foreign observers viewed Russia's political and economic development, what concerns they had about stability and rule of law, and what kinds of changes might improve Russia's international relationships. These conversations reinforced Putin's belief that Russia needed stronger, more predictable government institutions to succeed in the global economy. International investors and partners wanted assurance that contracts would be honoured, that regulatory policies would be consistent, and that political changes wouldn't arbitrarily alter business conditions. The oligarch-dominated system created too much uncertainty and instability to attract the kind of long-term investment that Russia needed for sustainable development. His international contacts also provided Putin with comparative perspective on how other countries managed the relationship between government and business. He studied how successful economies balance private enterprise with state oversight, how they maintained rule of law while encouraging innovation, and how they attracted foreign investment while while protecting national interests. These lessons would prove crucial when he gained the authority to implement policy changes. As Putin's responsibilities expanded, he began to attract attention from senior government officials who were looking for competent administrators to handle increasingly complex challenges. His reputation for reliability, analytical skill, and political discretion made him a valuable asset for leaders who needed subordinates they could trust with sensitive assignments. This attention culminated in his appointment as Deputy Chief of the Presidential Administration in 1997, a position that gave him significantly more authority and access to high-level policy discussions. The promotion reflected both his demonstrated competence and the growing recognition among senior officials that Putin possessed an unusual combination of technical skills and political sophistication. The Deputy Chief position required Putin to coordinate between different government agencies, manage relationships with regional leaders, and oversee implementation of presidential initiatives across a wide range of policy areas. This work gave him comprehensive understanding of how the federal government actually functioned, as opposed to how it was supposed to work according to official organizational charts and procedures. He discovered that the Russian government was far more fragmented and dysfunctional than most outside observers realized. Different agencies pursued conflicting objectives, bureaucratic rivalries prevented effective coordination, and many officials were more loyal to oligarch patrons than to government superiors. The presidential administration itself was divided into competing factions that spent as much energy fighting each other as implementing policy. These observations reinforced Putin's conviction that Russia needed fundamental reforms to create effective governance. The oligarch system wasn't just economically inefficient, it was politically destructive, undermining state capacity and preventing the kind of coordinated policy implementation that modern societies required. Any leader serious about strengthening Russia would eventually need to confront oligarch influence and rebuild government institutions. Putin's analysis of the oligarch problem was characteristically systematic and strategic. He identified which oligarchs controlled which industries, how they maintained their influence, and what resources they could deploy to resist government pressure. He studied their business operations to understand their sources of vulnerability, their international relationships, and their dependence on government policies and contracts. This research revealed that the oligarchs' apparent invincibility was largely illusory. Their wealth was often built on questionable legal foundations. Their business empires were highly leveraged and vulnerable to financial pressure, and their political influence depended on relationships with officials who could be replaced or pressured to change their positions. Most importantly, the legitimacy with the Russian people was minimal, making them vulnerable to populist appeals that framed oligarch wealth as unpatriotic exploitation. Putin also recognized that the oligarchs' greatest weakness was their disunity. They competed with each other more than they cooperated, making it difficult for them to present a unified response to government pressure. A skilled politician could exploit these divisions, playing oligarchs against each other while gradually reducing their collective influence over government policy. By 1998, Putin had developed a sophisticated understanding of Russia's political and economic system, including its strengths, weaknesses, and potential for transformation. His years in Moscow had taught him how power actually functioned at the federal level, how various factions competed for influence, and how a determined leader might reshape the entire system to serve different objectives. The oligarchs had created a form of capitalism that served their narrow interests while undermining Russia's broader development potential. Their influence prevented effective governance, discouraged long-term investment, and created massive inequality that threatened social stability. Putin understood that challenging this system would be dangerous, but he also believed it was necessary for Russia's future prosperity and international competitiveness. His experience observing the oligarch wars had shown Putin both the possibilities and limitations of economic power in political competition. Wealth could buy influence, but it couldn't guarantee security if the underlying political system changed. The oligarchs who seemed invincible in 1996 might find themselves vulnerable if a leader emerged who understood their weaknesses and had the will to exploit them. Putin was positioning himself to be exactly that kind of leader. His careful study of the oligarch system, his cultivation of relationships across factional lines, and his demonstrated competence in government administration were all preparing him for the opportunity to reshape Russia's political and economic landscape. The chaos of the 1990s had created the oligarch problem, but it had also created the conditions that would allow someone with Putin's skills and determination to solve it. The young intelligence officer who had returned from Dresden with a sophisticated understanding of how political systems could collapse was now an experienced government official with detailed knowledge of how they could be rebuilt. Putin's time in the oligarch wars had taught him that Russia's transformation was far from complete, and that the next phase would require a leader capable of confronting entrenched interests while building new institutions capable of governing a modern state. He was preparing to become that leader, armed with insights gained from years of careful observation, strategic relationship building, and patient preparations for the moment when opportunity would meet capability. The oligarchs had inadvertently created their own greatest threat by allowing someone like Putin to study their methods, understand their vulnerabilities, and develop the skills necessary to challenge their dominance of Russian politics and economics. By 1998, Boris Yeltsin's presidency was approaching its final act. Though few observers understood how dramatically Russian politics was about to change, Yeltsin had dominated the post-Soviet transition period through a combination of political cunning, personal charisma, and sheer force of will, but his health was deteriorating rapidly, and his public approval ratings had collapsed to single digits. The economic crisis that struck Russia in August of 1998 dealt a devastating blow to what remained of his credibility, making it clear that his political legacy would depend largely on his choice of successor. The succession question consumed Russian politics during this period, with various factions maneuvering to position their candidates for the eventual transition. The oligarchs were particularly active in these discussions, understanding that the next president would determine whether their influence would continue or whether they might face serious challenges to their economic and political dominance. They needed someone who would protect their interests while possessing enough legitimacy to govern effectively. Putin's name rarely appeared in media speculation about potential successors during this period. He was still seen as a competent but unremarkable administrator whose career had been built on loyalty and technical skills rather than political leadership or popular appeal. This perception was exactly what Putin wanted to maintain, while he positioned himself for opportunities that might emerge from the succession struggle. His appointment as director of the Federal Security Service in July 1998 marked his emergence from the shadows of bureaucratic anonymity into a position of real institutional power. The FSB was the main successor organization to the KGB, responsible for domestic security, counterintelligence, and various other functions that made it one of the most important agencies in the Russian government. Leading this organization required not just administrative skill, but political sophistication and the ability to manage relationships with various power centers. The FSB directorship was a natural fit for Putin's background and capabilities, but it also represented a calculated risk. Intelligence agencies were politically sensitive organizations that could make their directors powerful allies or dangerous enemies for other government officials. Putin would need to navigate these dynamics carefully, demonstrating loyalty to his superiors while avoiding the factional conflicts that had destroyed other agency heads. Putin's approach to managing the FSB reflected the strategic thinking he had developed during his years observing Russian politics. He focused on rebuilding the agency's institutional capacity and professional competence rather than using it as a tool for personal political advancement. This strategy served multiple purposes. It improved the FSB's effectiveness, enhanced Putin's reputation as a competent administrator, and positioned the agency as a potential counterweight to oligarch influence. The FSB under Putin's leadership began reasserting government authority in areas where it had been weakened during the chaotic 1990s. The agency increased its focus on economic crimes, corruption investigations, and activities that challenged state sovereignty. This work brought Putin into conflict with some oligarchs who had benefited from weak law enforcement, but it also demonstrated his commitment to strengthening state institutions. More importantly, Putin used his position at the FSB to develop intelligence about various political and economic actors that would prove valuable in future power struggles. The agency's resources allowed him to understand the vulnerabilities of potential rivals, the strengths and weaknesses of different factions, and the leverage points that could be used to influence political outcomes. His management of the FSB also provided Putin with opportunities to build relationships with regional security officials, military leaders, and other power brokers who controlled important resources and constituencies. These connections would prove crucial when he needed to mobilize support for his own political ambitions or challenge opponents who threatened his position. Putin's tenure at the FSB coincided with a series of apartment bombings in Moscow and other Russian cities that killed hundreds of civilians and created a climate of fear and uncertainty. The government blamed these attacks on Chechen terrorists, using them to justify a renewed military campaign in Chechnya that would become one of the defining issues of Putin's later presidency. The investigation and response response to these bombings demonstrated Putin's willingness to use decisive action in crisis situations, but they also raised questions about the FSB's competence and the government's handling of domestic security threats. Some critics suggested that the security services had prior knowledge of the attacks, or might even have been involved in planning them as a pretext for military action in Chechnya. These controversies revealed both the opportunities and dangers that came with Putin's position. Leadership of the FSB gave him significant resources and influence, but it also made him responsible for the agency's failures and controversial actions. He would need to balance the benefits of institutional power against the risks of becoming associated with unpopular or questionable policies. Putin's response to these challenges demonstrated the political instincts that would characterize his later leadership style. He avoided detailed public discussions of controversial issues while focusing on projecting competence and determination. He emphasized results rather than methods, appealing to public desires for security and stability without getting bogged down in debates about specific tactics or procedures. This approach reflected Putin's understanding that Russian public opinion was more concerned with effectiveness than with procedural niceties or democratic accountability. The chaos of the 1990s had created widespread demand for strong leadership and institutional competence, making voters willing to accept aggressive methods if they produced desired outcomes. Yeltsin's decision to appoint Putin as Prime Minister in August 1999 surprised most political observers, who had expected the president to choose a more experienced politician or someone with stronger connections to major political factions. Putin's selection seemed to reflect Yeltsin's assessment that Russia needed a leader who could restore order and effectiveness to government operations rather than someone who would serve particular factional interests. The prime ministerial appointment thrust Putin into the center of Russian politics at a moment when the country faced serious challenges, both domestically and internationally. The economy was still recovering from the 1998 financial crisis. Chechnya was descending into renewed warfare, and public confidence in government institutions remained extremely low. Putin would need to demonstrate leadership capabilities that went far beyond his previous administrative experience. His early performance as Prime Minister exceeded most expectations and established him as a serious contender for the presidency. Putin approached the job with characteristic methodical preparation, surrounding himself with competent advisors while maintaining tight control over major policy decisions. He projected confidence and decisiveness that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty and chaos that had characterized much of the Yeltsin era. The Second Chechen War, which began shortly after Putin became Prime Minister, provided him with opportunities to demonstrate leadership qualities that resonated with Russian public opinion. His willingness to use military force against what he characterized as terrorist threats, combined with his tough rhetoric about defending Russian sovereignty, appealed to voters who were tired of national weakness and international humiliation. Putin's handling of the Chechen conflict revealed both his strategic thinking and his understanding of domestic political dynamics. He framed the military campaign not as a colonial war or territorial dispute, but as part of a broader struggle against international terrorism that threatened Russian citizens. This narrative connected the conflict to global concerns about security, while positioning Russia as part of an international coalition against terrorist threats. The military campaign also allowed Putin to build relationships with defense and security officials who would become crucial supporters during his rise to power. His willingness to support military operations and provide resources for security agencies demonstrated his commitment to strengthening institutions that had been neglected during the economic focus of the early transition period. Perhaps most importantly, Putin's management of the Chechen War showed his ability to maintain public support for controversial policies through effective communication and strategic framing. He understood that Russian voters would accept significant costs and risks if they believed their leaders were defending fundamental national interests with competence and determination. As Putin's approval ratings climbed throughout late 1999, it became increasingly clear that he was Yeltsin's intended successor. The ailing president's decision to resign early on December 31st, 1999 was designed to give Putin the advantages of incumbency during the upcoming presidential election, while allowing Yeltsin to depart on his own terms rather than waiting for his term to expire. The early resignation was a masterful political maneuver that caught Putin's potential rivals off guard while maximizing his chances of electoral success. As acting president, Putin could use the resources and visibility of the office to build support while his opponents struggled to develop effective campaign strategies in the compressed time frame before the election. Putin's response to unexpected early elevation to the presidency demonstrated the leadership qualities that would define his long tenure in power. Rather than appearing overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility, he projected calm confidence and immediately began implementing policies that reinforced his image as a decisive leader, committed to restoring Russian strength and stability. His presidential campaign, while brief, effectively communicated themes that would resonate throughout his political career. Putin promised to restore order to Russian society, rebuild state institutions, and reassert Russia's position as a major international power. These messages appealed to voters who were exhausted by the uncertainty and weakness of the transition period. The campaign also revealed Putin's sophisticated understanding of Russian political psychology and his ability to connect with popular concerns without appearing populist or demagogic. He presented himself as a competent professional who would solve problems through systematic work rather than through dramatic gestures or ideological appeals. Putin's electoral victory in March 2000 was decisive enough to avoid a runoff, giving him a clear mandate for the changes he planned to implement. But the margin of victory also reflected the weakness of his opposition. Rather than overwhelming popular enthusiasm for his candidacy, most voters supported Putin, not because they were inspired by his vision, but because they believed he offered the best hope for stability and competence after years of chaos. The new president faced enormous challenges that would test all the skills he had developed during his long apprenticeship in Russian politics. The oligarchs expected him to be a manageable successor to Yeltsin, who would protect their interests while providing more effective governance. Regional leaders hoped he would restore federal authority without undermining their local autonomy. International partners wanted assurance that Russia would continue its integration into global institutions while maintaining predictable policies. Putin's response to these expectations would determine not just his own political survival, but the future direction of Russian development. His years of preparation had given him detailed understanding of the system's strengths and weaknesses, but translating that knowledge into effective leadership would require skills and capabilities that no amount of preparation could guarantee. The unknown bureaucrat who had risen to power through competence, loyalty, and strategic patience was now positioned to reshape Russian politics according to his own vision. Whether that vision would strengthen Russia's democratic institutions or undermine them remained to be seen, but there was little doubt that Putin's presidency would be fundamentally different from the chaotic experimentation that had characterized the Yeltsin era. His election marked the end of Russia's post-Soviet transition period and the beginning of a new phase in the country's development. The oligarch-dominated capitalism of the 1990s, the weak federal authority, and the international marginalization that had defined the decade were all about to face serious challenges from a leader who understood their vulnerabilities and possessed the institutional power necessary to address them. Putin had spent more than a decade studying Russian politics, building relationships across factional lines, and developing strategies for strengthening state capacity. His moment had finally arrived, and he was better prepared than perhaps any leader in Russian history to use presidential power effectively. The question was whether his vision of effective governance would prove compatible with the democratic aspirations that had initially motivated Russia's post-Soviet transformation. Putin's inauguration as president on May 7, 2000 marked the beginning of the most systematic transformation of Russian politics since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The man who took the oath of office that day had spent years studying the weaknesses of Russia's post-Soviet system and developing strategies to address them, unlike his predecessor, who had often governed through improvisation and crisis management. Putin approached the presidency with clear objectives and methodical plans for achieving them. His first priority was establishing undisputed control over the federal government itself. The Yeltsin administration had been plagued by competing power centers, bureaucratic infighting, and unclear chains of command that made coherent policy implementation nearly impossible. Putin recognized that effective governance required centralizing authority and ensuring that presidential decisions would be carried out without the delays and distortions that had characterized the previous decade. The new president moved quickly to replace key officials with individuals whose loyalty he could count on. Many of these appointments went to people he had worked with during his years in St. Petersburg of the security services, creating a network of personal relationships that extended throughout the government hierarchy. This wasn't simply nepotism. Putin was building a system based on trust and shared understanding, rather than the formal institutional relationships that had proven inadequate during the transition period. Putin's approach to personnel management reflected lessons he had learned during his intelligence career about the importance of controlling information flows and maintaining operational security. He understood that policy decisions were only as good as their implementation, and that implementation depended on having reliable people in the key positions who understood both the specific requirements of their jobs and the broader objectives of the administration. The centralization of authority extended beyond personnel decisions to fundamental changes in how the federal government related to other power centers. Putin began systematically reducing the autonomy that regional governors had gained during the Yeltsin years, when weak central authority had forced the federal government to negotiate with local leaders as equals rather than subordinates. The creation of federal districts with presidential representatives who could override regional decisions was one of the most significant early reforms. These representatives, many of whom came from security service backgrounds, were given broad authority to ensure that federal law was enforced consistently across the country. This reform effectively ended the parade of sovereignties that had threatened to fragment Russia during the 1990s. Putin's relationship with the oligarchs during his early presidency was more complex than many observers understood at the time. Rather than immediately confronting their influence, he initially offered them a deal. They could maintain their business empires as long as they stayed out of politics and accepted the government's authority in matters of national importance. This approach reflected both strategic calculation and practical necessity. The oligarchs controlled too many resources and had too much influence for Putin to challenge them all simultaneously without risking economic chaos or political instability. Instead, he chose to separate them from direct political power while allowing them to continue their business activities under increased government oversight. This strategy would allow him to strengthen state institutions before confronting oligarch influence more directly. The arrangement also served Putin's broader objective of professionalizing Russian politics by reducing the role of personal wealth in determining political outcomes. The oligarchs' influence had made democratic competition nearly impossible, since their resources allowed them to dominate media coverage, fund favoured candidates, and manipulate electoral processes. Limiting their political involvement was essential for creating a more predictable and governable political system. However, Putin's early relationship with the oligarchs was tested by the case of Vladimir Putin, who owned independent media, including the NTV television network that had been critical of government policies. Putin's arrest in June 2000 on fraud charges sent a clear message about the limits of the new arrangement. The oligarchs could maintain their wealth, but they could not use it to challenge government authority or policy decisions. The Putin case revealed Putin's understanding that information control was crucial for maintaining political authority in the modern era. Television remained the primary source of political information for most Russians, making media ownership a form of political power that needed to be regulated like any other challenge to state authority. The message to other oligarchs was clear: cooperation would be rewarded, but opposition would be punished. Putin's approach to media control reflected his intelligence background and his understanding of how public opinion shaped political possibilities. Rather than imposing crude censorship, he focused on ensuring that major media outlets would present government policies favourably, while limiting coverage of opposition viewpoints. This strategy was more sophisticated than Soviet-era propaganda, appearing to maintain press freedom while actually constraining it in ways that served government interests. The Second Chechen War, which had begun during Putin's tenure as Prime Minister, became the defining military conflict of his early presidency. His handling of this war revealed both his strategic thinking about the use of force and his understanding of how military success could be translated into political capital. The conflict also demonstrated his willingness to accept significant costs in pursuit of objectives he considered essential for Russian security. Putin's approach to Chechnya was fundamentally different from the earlier Russian military intervention in the 1990s. Rather than treating it as a limited police action or humanitarian intervention, he framed it as part of a broader struggle against international terrorism that threatened not just regional stability, but Russian sovereignty itself. This narrative connected the conflict to global security concerns, while justifying the use of maximum force against what he characterized as terrorist enemies. The military strategy emphasized overwhelming force and systematic destruction of opposition capabilities rather than the negotiated settlement that some had advocated. Putin rejected suggestions that the conflict could be resolved through political compromise, arguing that negotiating with terrorists would only encourage further challenges to Russian authority. This approach reflected his belief that strength and determination were more effective than flexibility or accommodation in dealing with security threats. The conduct of the Chechen War also revealed Putin's understanding of the relationship between military action and domestic political support. He recognized that Russian public opinion would support military casualties and financial costs if they believed the government was defending fundamental national interests with competence and determination. His regular communication about military progress and his personal involvement in strategic decisions helped maintain public confidence in the operation. More controversially, Putin's handling of Chechnya demonstrated his willingness to accept civilian casualties and human rights violations if they served broader strategic objectives. International criticism of Russian military tactics was dismissed as interference in internal affairs, while domestic criticism was characterized as unpatriotic or naive about the realities of fighting terrorism. This response revealed Putin's priorities and his assessment of what Russian public opinion would accept. The Chechen conflict also provided Putin with opportunities to build relationships with military and security officials who would become important supporters throughout his presidency. His willingness to provide resources for military operations and his personal attention to the concerns of security services helped establish his credibility with institutions that had felt neglected during the economic focus of the Yeltsin years. By demonstrating competence in managing a complex military operation while maintaining domestic political support, Putin established himself as a leader capable of using force effectively when necessary. This reputation would prove valuable in future confrontations with both domestic opponents and international rivals who might otherwise be tempted to test Russian resolve. Putin's early economic policies reflected his understanding that political stability required both improved living standards and reduced dependence on foreign economic assistance. The devaluation of the ruble following the 1998 financial crisis had actually helped Russian manufacturing by making imports more expensive and exports more competitive. Putin's government built on these trends by implementing policies that supported domestic production while gradually reducing reliance on international monetary fund loans and foreign debt. The improvement in Russia's fiscal position was helped significantly by rising energy prices that increased government revenues from oil and gas exports. Putin's administration used these resources to pay down foreign debt, build currency reserves, and increase government spending on salaries, pensions, and social programs that had been cut during the economic crisis. These policies helped restore public confidence in government institutions while reducing Russia's vulnerability to external economic pressure. Putin also began implementing reforms designed to strengthen state capacity in economic regulation and tax collection. The creation of a more effective federal tax service reduced the revenue losses that had plagued the government during the 1990s, while new regulatory frameworks gave the state more tools for overseeing banking, energy, and other strategic sectors. These changes reflected Putin's belief that economic sovereignty required strong government institutions capable of managing market forces rather than being overwhelmed by them. The early economic improvements under Putin's presidency were modest, but psychologically important for a population that had endured nearly a decade of declining living standards and economic uncertainty. Even small increases in wages and pensions represented significant improvements for people who had learned not to expect competent economic management from their government. Putin's ability to deliver tangible benefits helped establish his credibility and build public support for other aspects of his agenda. Putin's approach to constitutional and legal reform during his early presidency revealed his systematic thinking about the requirements for effective governance. Rather than making dramatic changes to fundamental laws, he focused on clarifying ambiguities and strengthening enforcement mechanisms that would make existing institutions more effective. This approach reflected both his legal training and his preference for incremental changes that would not trigger constitutional crises or political instability. One of the most significant early legal changes was the reform of the Federation Council, the upper house of parliament that had been dominated by regional governors who used their positions to block federal initiatives. Putin's changes reduced regional influence over federal legislation while ensuring that the upper house would support rather than obstruct presidential initiatives. This reform was crucial for his broader agenda of centralizing authority and reducing regional autonomy. Putin also began strengthening the role of federal law enforcement agencies in investigating economic crimes and corruption. These efforts were selective and strategic rather than comprehensive. focusing on cases that would demonstrate government authority while avoiding investigations that might destabilize the entire system. The message was clear: cooperation with federal authorities would be rewarded, while resistance would be met with legal consequences. The legal reforms reflected Putin's understanding that rule of law and government authority were not contradictory but complementary. Strong legal institutions could actually enhance government effectiveness by providing predictable frameworks for economic and political activity, while ensuring that challenges to state authority would be resolved through legal rather than extra-legal means. His early approach to international relations emphasized rebuilding Russia's credibility as a reliable partner, while gradually reasserting its influence in areas that had been considered part of the Soviet sphere of influence. Putin recognized that Russia's international position had been severely weakened during the 1990s, when economic crisis and political instability had forced the country to accept a subordinate role in many international forums. The new president's foreign policy strategy emphasized practical cooperation with Western countries on issues of mutual interest, while avoiding the appearance of subordination or dependence that had characterized some of Yeltsin's international relationships. Putin was willing to work with the United States and European countries, but only as an equal partner rather than a junior ally seeking approval or assistance. This approach was evident in Putin's response to the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks in the United States. His immediate offer of cooperation in fighting international terrorism was both genuine and strategic, demonstrating Russian willingness to work with Western allies while positioning Russia as an essential partner in addressing global security challenges. The cooperation also provided opportunities to rebuild relationships that had been strained by disagreements over NATO expansion and other issues. Putin's early presidency established patterns of governance that would characterize his long tenure in power. He demonstrated systematic thinking about the requirements for effective leadership, willingness to use both incentives and coercion to achieve his objectives, and sophisticated understanding of how domestic and international factors affected Russian political possibilities. Most importantly, he showed that he possessed both the vision and the capabilities necessary to transform Russia's political system according to his own strategic priorities. The consolidation of control during Putin's early years was not simply about accumulating personal power, but about building institutional capacity for governance that had been lacking during the chaotic transition period. Whether this institutionalization would strengthen or weaken Russian democracy remained to be seen, but there was little doubt that Putin's presidency represented a fundamental break from the experimental and often ineffective governance that had characterized the previous decade. By 2004, Putin had successfully consolidated domestic political control, but his vision for Russia extended far beyond internal stability. He understood that lasting power required not just effective governance at home, but the ability to project influence internationally and secure Russia's position as a major global player. The key to achieving these objectives lay in leveraging Russia's vast natural resource wealth, particularly its enormous reserves of oil and natural gas that could be transformed from economic assets into instruments of geopolitical power. Putin's approach to energy policy represented a fundamental departure from the chaotic privatization of the 1990s, when valuable state assets had been sold to oligarchs for fractions of their true worth. He recognized that energy resources were too strategically important to remain under private control, especially when those controlling them might have interests that conflicted with national objectives. The systematic renationalization of key energy assets would become one of the defining features of his presidency. The campaign to regain state control over energy resources began with careful preparation and strategic timing. Putin's team spent months analyzing the legal vulnerabilities of privatization deals, identifying companies whose ownership structures were questionable, and developing plans for reasserting government authority without triggering economic chaos or massive capital flight. The goal was to demonstrate that the state could reclaim strategic assets while maintaining enough stability to preserve investor confidence in other sectors. The most dramatic early example of this strategy was the destruction of Yukos, the oil company controlled by oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Khodorkovsky had made the fatal mistake of challenging Putin's authority directly, funding opposition political parties and publicly criticizing government policies. His arrest in October 2003 sent shockwaves through Russia's business community and marked marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to break up his business empire. The Yukos affair was carefully orchestrated to appear as a legitimate law enforcement action rather than political persecution. Tax authorities claimed the company owed billions in back taxes, while prosecutors alleged various forms of fraud and tax evasion. These charges weren't entirely fabricated. Most major Russian companies had engaged in questionable practices during the chaotic 1990s, but the selective prosecution of Khodorkovsky, while similar violations by other companies went unpunished, revealed the political motivations behind the case. Putin's handling of the Yukos crisis demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of how to use legal mechanisms to achieve political objectives while maintaining plausible deniability. He rarely spoke publicly about the case, allowing prosecutors and tax officials to present it as routine law enforcement, while avoiding direct association with what appeared to be persecution of a political opponent. This approach allowed him to achieve his goals while minimizing damage to his reputation for respecting rule of law. The breakup of Yukos also revealed Putin's strategic thinking about the relationship between private wealth and state power. Khodorkovsky's mistake wasn't just challenging government policies, but demonstrating that private individuals could accumulate enough resources to threaten state authority. The message to other oligarchs was clear. They could maintain their wealth only as long as they accepted subordinate roles and avoided direct political competition with the president. Most of Yukos' assets were eventually acquired by Rosneft, the state-controlled oil company that became the primary vehicle for implementing Putin's energy strategy. Under the leadership of Igor Sechin, one of Putin's closest allies, Rosneft embarked on an aggressive expansion program that would make it one of the world's largest oil companies and a crucial instrument of Russian foreign policy. The renationalization of energy assets extended beyond oil to include natural gas, where the state-controlled Gazprom already held a dominant position in the domestic market. Putin's government strengthened Gazprom's monopoly over gas exports while using the company's control over pipeline infrastructure to influence the policies of neighboring countries that depended on Russian energy supplies. This strategy transformed energy exports from commercial transactions into geopolitical leverage. Putin's energy strategy was based on the recognition that Europe's growing dependence on Russian gas and oil created opportunities for political influence that could partially compensate for Russia's relative weakness in other areas. While Russia couldn't match the United States in military spending or China in manufacturing capacity, it could become indispensable to European energy security in ways that would constrain their foreign policy options and enhance Russian diplomatic leverage. The construction of new pipeline infrastructure became a central element of this strategy. Projects like the Nord Stream pipeline, which would carry Russian gas directly to Germany through the Baltic Sea, were designed not just to improve export revenues but to create new forms of interdependence that would make it difficult for European countries to pursue policies that Russia opposed. Energy infrastructure investments became instruments of soft power projection. Putin's approach to energy diplomacy revealed his understanding of how economic relationships could be transformed into political influence without direct coercion or military threats. Countries that depended on Russian energy supplies would need to consider Russian interests when making policy decisions, even if they weren't explicitly pressured to do so. The mere possibility that energy supplies might be disrupted created incentives for accommodation that enhanced Russian influence throughout Europe. The energy strategy also served important domestic political purposes by generating enormous revenues that could be used to fund government operations, build currency reserves, and finance social programs that maintain public support. The creation of sovereign wealth funds allowed Russia to accumulate financial resources that provided both economic stability and foreign policy flexibility. These funds could be used to support allies, finance international projects, or weather economic crises without depending on external assistance. Rising global energy prices during the 2000s provided Putin with unprecedented resources for implementing his domestic and international objectives. Oil revenues funded military modernization programs, infrastructure projects, and social spending that helped maintain his popularity while demonstrating the benefits of his leadership to skeptical constituencies. The energy boom also allowed Russia to pay off foreign debts and reduce its dependence on international financial institutions. Putin used these abundant resources strategically rather than simply distributing them broadly through the economy. Key priorities included rebuilding military capabilities that had deteriorated during the 1990s, modernizing infrastructure in strategically important regions, and creating financial reserves that could provide stability during future economic downturns. This approach reflected his understanding that resource wealth needed to be converted into lasting institutional capabilities rather than consumed through immediate spending. The energy revenues also enabled Putin to pursue more assertive foreign policy policies without worrying about economic constraints that had limited Russian options during the previous decade. Military interventions, support for allied governments, and challenges to Western policies all became more feasible when backed by substantial financial resources that reduced Russia's vulnerability to economic pressure or sanctions. Putin's energy strategy extended beyond Europe to include relationships with major Asian consumers, particularly China and India, that could provide alternative markets if European demand declined or political relationships deteriorated. The construction of pipelines to China and long-term supply agreements with Asian partners created diversified export options that reduced Russian dependence on any single market, while potentially creating competition among consumers for Russian resources. These Asian relationships also served broader geopolitical objectives by strengthening partnerships with countries that shared Russian skepticism about Western dominance of international institutions. Energy cooperation became a foundation for broader strategic partnerships that could challenge American influence in various regions while providing Russia with allies in international forums where it faced criticism of its domestic or foreign policies. The development of energy relationships with countries like Iran and Venezuela created opportunities for cooperation among major oil and gas producers that could potentially influence global energy markets. While Russia never pursued formal cartel arrangements that might provoke Western retaliation, coordination among friendly producers provided some to influence prices and supply conditions in ways that served Russian interests. Putin's approach to energy policy also reflected his understanding of how technological developments might affect Russia's strategic position. The growth of renewable energy sources, improvements in energy efficiency, and development of alternative suppliers all posed potential threats to Russian influence that needed to be addressed through careful planning and strategic investments. Rather than simply defending existing market positions, Putin's government invested in new technologies and alternative energy sources that could maintain Russian relevance even as global energy markets evolved. These investments included nuclear power technology that could be exported to countries seeking alternatives to fossil fuels, renewable energy projects that demonstrated Russian technological capabilities, and research into emerging energy technologies that might create new export opportunities. The energy strategy also involved significant efforts to improve the efficiency and environmental performance of Russian energy production. While these improvements were partly motivated by international pressure and market demands, they also served strategic purposes by reducing production costs, extending the life of existing reserves, and maintaining Russia's competitiveness against alternative suppliers who might offer cleaner or more efficient energy sources. Putin's management of Russia's energy wealth demonstrated both the opportunities and challenges that came with resource-based development strategies. The enormous revenues generated by oil and gas exports provided unprecedented resources for domestic and foreign policy objectives, but they also created dependencies that could become vulnerabilities if market conditions changed or alternative energy sources reduced demand for Russian exports. The concentration of economic growth in energy sectors also created risks of Dutch disease, the phenomenon where resource exports drive up currency values in ways that make other economic sectors less competitive internationally. Putin's government attempted to address these risks through industrial policies designed to diversify the economy, while using energy revenues to fund development in manufacturing, technology, and other sectors that could reduce long-term dependence on resource export. By the mid-2000s, Putin's energy strategy had transformed Russia from a financially dependent country seeking international assistance into a major power capable of influencing global energy markets and challenging Western policies in various regions. The success of this transformation provided validation for Putin's approach to governance while creating new possibilities for asserting Russian influence in international affairs. The energy empire that Putin constructed served multiple purposes simultaneously, generating enormous revenues for domestic programs, creating geopolitical leverage through supply relationships, funding military modernization and foreign policy initiatives, and demonstrating the benefits of strong state control over strategic resources. This comprehensive approach reflected Putin's systematic thinking about how economic assets could be transformed into political power on both domestic and international levels. However, the energy strategy also created new vulnerabilities and dependencies that would shape Russian policy options for decades to come. The economy's dependence on resource exports made it vulnerable to price fluctuations and market changes, while the use of energy supplies as foreign policy tools created incentives for consumers to seek alternative sources and reduce their dependence on Russian exports. Putin's energy empire represented both the culmination of his domestic consolidation efforts and the foundation for his emergence as a major major international leader. The transformation of Russia's energy resources from private assets controlled by oligarchs into state-controlled instruments of power projection demonstrated his ability to think strategically about complex challenges while implementing long-term plans that served multiple objectives simultaneously. The success of the energy strategy during the 2000s would provide Putin with the confidence and resources necessary to pursue increasingly assertive policies that challenged Western dominance and demonstrated Russia's return to great power status. But it also created expectations and dependencies that would shape Russian policies and vulnerabilities for years to come, making energy wealth both a source of strength and a potential weakness in Putin's ongoing effort to restore Russian power and influence. By 2008, Putin had fundamentally transformed Russia's political system, but constitutional term limits appeared to present an obstacle to his continued rule. The Russian constitution prohibited presidents from serving more than 2 consecutive terms, creating what seemed like a forced interruption in Putin's consolidation of power. However, his response to this challenge revealed both his strategic thinking and his commitment to maintaining control, regardless of formal constitutional constraints. The selection of Dmitry Medvedev as Putin's chosen successor was a masterful political maneuver that maintained the appearance of constitutional compliance while ensuring continuity of Putin's policies. Medvedev had been a loyal subordinate throughout Putin's presidency, serving in various administrative roles without developing an independent political base or expressing policy positions that differed from his patron's preferences. His nomination guaranteed that Putin's influence would continue even if he temporarily stepped back from the presidency. Putin's decision to accept the position of Prime Minister under Medvedev created an unprecedented arrangement in Russian politics, a situation where the formal head of government clearly remained subordinate to his supposed subordinate. This tandem arrangement confused many international observers who struggled to understand how power actually functioned in the new configuration, but it demonstrated Putin's ability to maintain control through personal relationships rather than formal institutional positions. The 2008 global financial crisis provided Putin with opportunities to demonstrate his continued relevance and leadership capabilities even while serving as Prime Minister. Russia's response to the economic downturn, including massive government spending programs and support for strategic industries, bore clear evidence of Putin's strategic thinking and priorities. His public role in managing the crisis reinforced perceptions that he remained the real decision-maker regardless of his official title. More significantly, the crisis in Georgia that erupted in August 2008 marked Putin's emergence as a leader willing to use military force to challenge Western influence and defend what he considered vital Russian interests. The brief but decisive military intervention demonstrated Russia's rebuilt military capabilities while sending clear messages about the limits of Western expansion into areas that Russia considered part of its sphere of influence. Putin's approach to the Georgia crisis revealed his understanding of how limited military action could achieve broader strategic objectives without triggering overwhelming Western retaliation. The intervention was brief enough to minimize international reaction, while decisive enough to achieve its objectives of preventing Georgia's NATO membership and demonstrating Russian military capabilities. This calibrated use of force would become a characteristic feature of Putin's international strategy. The Georgia intervention also marked the beginning of Putin's systematic challenge to the post-Cold War international order that had been dominated by Western institutions and American leadership. His speeches during this period began explicitly criticizing what he characterized as American hegemony and calling for a multipolar world order that would provide greater roles for countries like Russia, China, and other non-Western powers. Putin's critique of Western dominance wasn't simply rhetorical posturing but reflected genuine strategic calculations about how Russia could enhance its international position by challenging existing power structures. He recognized that the unipolar moment following the Soviet collapse was ending as other powers gained strength and confidence, creating opportunities for Russia to play a larger role in shaping international affairs. The development of closer relationships with China during this period reflected Putin's understanding that Russia needed powerful allies to effectively challenge Western dominance. The strategic partnership with Beijing provided both countries with alternatives to Western-dominated institutions, while creating a powerful bloc that could resist American pressure on various international issues. Energy cooperation, military coordination, and diplomatic collaboration all strengthened this partnership. Putin's return to the presidency in 2012 marked the beginning of his most assertive period in both domestic and international affairs. The massive protests that followed parliamentary elections in 2011 and presidential elections in 2012 represented the most serious domestic challenge to his authority since coming to power, but his response demonstrated both his determination to maintain control and his willingness to use increasingly harsh methods to suppress opposition. The crackdown on opposition movements after 2012 revealed the authoritarian trajectory that Putin's system had been following since his early years in power. New laws restricting civil society organizations, harsh penalties for unauthorized protests, and systematic persecution of opposition leaders created an increasingly repressive environment that eliminated most forms of legitimate political competition. Putin's approach to domestic opposition reflected his belief that Russia faced coordinated Western efforts to undermine its sovereignty through support for civil society organizations and opposition movements. His characterization of NGOs receiving foreign funding as foreign agents wasn't simply propaganda, but reflected genuine suspicion that Western countries were using soft power tools to weaken Russian political stability. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 represented the culmination of Putin's challenge to Western influence in what he considered Russia's natural sphere of influence. The operation demonstrated sophisticated military planning, effective use of propaganda and disinformation, and willingness to accept significant international costs in pursuit of strategic objectives that Putin considered essential for Russian security. Putin's decision to annex Crimea was driven partly by genuine security concerns about NATO expansion and partly by domestic political calculations about maintaining his popularity and legitimacy. The overwhelmingly positive public response to the annexation validated his assessment that assertive foreign policy could compensate for domestic economic problems and maintain public support for his leadership. The intervention in eastern Ukraine that followed the Crimean annexation revealed Putin's willingness to pursue proxy conflicts that advanced Russian interests while maintaining plausible deniability about direct involvement. The use of unmarked military forces, local militias and volunteers created ambiguity about Russian responsibility while achieving strategic objectives of preventing Ukrainian integration into Western institutions. Putin's approach to the Ukraine crisis demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of how modern conflicts could be fought through combinations of conventional military force, irregular warfare, information operations, and economic pressure. This hybrid warfare strategy allowed Russia to achieve significant objectives while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that might trigger overwhelming Western retaliation. The international sanctions imposed in response to Russian actions in Ukraine created new challenges, but also provided Putin with opportunities to demonstrate Russian resilience and reduce dependence on Western economic relationships. The government's response emphasized import substitution, closer ties with non-Western partners, and development of alternative financial and technological systems that could reduce vulnerability to future sanctions. Putin's management of the sanctions regime revealed his understanding that economic pressure could actually strengthen authoritarian systems by providing justification for increased state control over the economy and society. The external threat created by sanctions helped legitimize domestic repression while encouraging public unity around the leadership during a perceived crisis. The intervention in Syria beginning in 2015 marked Putin's emergence as a major player in Middle Eastern affairs and demonstrated Russia's ability to project military power far from its borders. The successful campaign to support the Assad government showcased Russian military capabilities while establishing Moscow as an essential player in regional affairs that had been dominated by the United States for decades. Putin's Syria strategy reflected his broader approach to international affairs, using limited but effective military interventions to achieve disproportionate influence while challenging Western dominance in key regions. The operation demonstrated that Russia could successfully compete with the United States in proxy conflicts while building relationships with regional partners who valued Russian reliability and effectiveness. The success in Syria also provided Putin with domestic political benefits by demonstrating Russian military competence and international influence to a public that valued displays of national strength. The relatively low cost of the intervention, combined with its strategic success, validated Putin's approach to foreign policy while enhancing his reputation as an effective leader capable of defending Russian interests. Putin's approach to relations with the West during his later years reflected reflected his conclusion that partnership and cooperation were no longer possible, given fundamental disagreements about international order and Russian sovereignty. His speeches increasingly characterized the relationship as a form of competition or conflict that required Russia to defend itself against Western efforts to weaken or contain Russian power. The allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 American presidential election marked a new phase in this confrontation, with Putin using information warfare and cyber capabilities to directly challenge Western democratic processes. Whether or not these operations achieved their intended objectives, they demonstrated Putin's willingness to take significant risks to weaken Western unity and confidence in democratic institutions. Putin's domestic policies during his later years have focused on ensuring regime stability and continuity while adapting to changing economic and social conditions. Constitutional amendments in 2020 that effectively reset his presidential term limits demonstrated his determination to remain in power indefinitely while maintaining the appearance of legal and constitutional governance. The development of new technologies for surveillance and social control has enhanced the state's ability to monitor and control domestic opposition while limiting the effectiveness of traditional forms of political organization. These capabilities have allowed Putin to maintain stability without relying primarily on crude repression, though the threat of punishment remains for those who challenge state authority too directly. Putin's management of the COVID-19 pandemic revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of his governance model. The state's ability to mobilize resources and implement policies quickly demonstrated the advantages of centralized authority, but the economic and social costs of the pandemic also highlighted the limitations of a system that prioritizes political control over adaptive governance. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 represented the culmination of Putin's confrontation with the West and his determination to reshape the international order through the use of military force. The decision to launch a major war against a neighboring country reflected his calculation that Russia's interests required decisive action, regardless of international costs or risks. Putin's approach to the Ukraine war has demonstrated both his strategic thinking and the limitations of his understanding of modern warfare and international relations. The initial expectation of rapid victory gave way to prolonged conflict that has tested Russian military capabilities and exposed weaknesses in planning and execution that weren't apparent during earlier, more limited operations. The international response to the invasion, including unprecedented sanctions and military support for Ukraine, has created challenges for Putin's regime that go far beyond previous confrontations with the West. The isolation of Russia from global financial and technological systems has forced adaptations that may fundamentally alter the country's development trajectory for decades to come. Putin's domestic response to the war has included increasingly harsh repression of opposition voices and independent media, reflecting his understanding that prolonged conflict requires tight control over information and public opinion. The introduction of wartime restrictions on civil liberties has accelerated trends toward authoritarianism that had been developing throughout his tenure in power. The economic costs of the war and sanctions have forced Putin to restructure Russia's relationships with the global economy while seeking new partnerships with countries willing to maintain economic ties despite Western pressure. This reorientation toward Asia, Africa, and Latin America represents a fundamental shift in Russian foreign policy that may outlast Putin's own tenure in power. Putin's legacy after more than 2 decades in power is complex and contradictory. He succeeded in restoring Russian sovereignty and international influence after the chaos of the 1990s, but at enormous cost in terms of domestic freedom and international relationships. His effectiveness as a strategist and crisis manager is evident in his political survival and Russia's enhanced global position, but his long-term impact on Russian development remains uncertain. The system Putin created has demonstrated remarkable stability, and his personal political skills have allowed him to maintain power through multiple crises and challenges. However, the increasing reliance on repression and confrontation suggests a regime that has lost much of its earlier adaptability and may be vulnerable to shocks that require fundamental changes in approach. Putin's transformation from an unknown bureaucrat to one of the world's most powerful and controversial leaders demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of individual agency in shaping historical events. His strategic thinking, political skills, and willingness to take calculated risks have allowed him to achieve objectives that seemed impossible during the chaotic 1990s, but they have also created new problems that may prove more difficult to solve than those he originally faced. The small boy who learned about power and survival in the communal apartments of post-war Leningrad, has become a leader whose decisions affect global politics and economics. Whether his legacy will be seen as successful defense of Russian interests or destructive pursuit of personal power will likely depend on events that have yet to unfold and consequences that may not become apparent for decades to come.